GreenSense show is sponsored by CEA Technology, providing a sustainable modular indoor growing system. Visit ceatechn.com to learn more. I'm Robert Colangelo, and this is GreenSense, where we bring you eco-innovations that are changing your world. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, 80% of the U.S. population lives in urban areas, which they define as densely populated urbanized areas of 50,000 or more people. Our cities are facing many challenges, which include poverty, environmental degradation, fiscal management, crowding, housing, traffic, public education, and crime. This week, Guest has a solution for improving the quality of life in cities and making them more resilient. Alison Sant is a partner and co-founder of the Studio for Urban Projects, an interdisciplinary design collaborative based in San Francisco that works at the intersection of architecture, urbanism, art, and social activism. She recently authored the book, From the Ground Up, Local Efforts to Create Resilient Cities. Alison, welcome to GreenSense.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here.
I've been a student of cities, trying to make them more sustainable for over 20 years. Cities are a great place to implement new sustainable initiatives. These large population centers provide an economy of scale to make green initiatives economically feasible, such as green infrastructure, replacing pipes with plants, hyper-local urban farms, cost-effective public transportation, net zero energy housing, and so on. So instead, we end up with major population centers filled with pollution, homelessness, high crime, with a very high cost of living. What went wrong in our big cities?
Gosh, what an important question. I think what went wrong is different in different places, probably. But I think that what's interesting now is that we have major opportunities to change that. We're seeing unprecedented levels of spending, federal spending, coming from the Biden administration. Something like $80 billion a year going into climate solutions. And I think it's an incredible opportunity for us to think about how we not only address both mitigating and adapting to climate change, but also how we think about addressing inequities, because cities are not working for so many people, as you point out. And I think we're left with the history of and the present tense very much of structural racism, and so much of what we're encountering today and what we will continue to encounter in the future is exasperating inequalities, as low-income communities, Black and Brown communities are affected more by climate change and disproportionately. So, from the ground up, I look at ways in which we can use both our focus on climate change and our interest in creating more equitable society in the United States as an opportunity for making cities better for everyone. And that we go into the future, not just not surviving it, but hopefully thriving in it.
So what gave you the idea for the book?
So as an urban designer, I've been working in San Francisco since the early 2000s, and the Studio for Urban Projects participated in tactical experiments and urban prototyping in San Francisco. And so from our streets to our shorelines, we have been involved in rethinking the design of our cities. And through this work, it's been really powerful to me that small experiments like retaking a parking spot and making it into a park could be leveraged to change cities. Probably many of your listeners are familiar with Parking Day, and where people would pay the parking meter and go out and turn a parking spot into a small scale park, as long as the meter ran. And that's engendered other projects like parklets, which have sprung up during the pandemic, and Times Square was closed to traffic. So, I'm interested in how these small scale efforts and experimentation were shaping other places. So I researched cities across the country and talked with people that were making a difference in their own communities. So one great example.
So you came up with the book from your work and talking with people? That was where the idea came from?
Yeah, so because we had been involved in so many small scale experiments and prototypes here, I was interested in what was happening around the country. and found many. I talked with over 90 people in writing the book, and came away very hopeful about so many of the community-led efforts throughout the United States.
Well, it's quite a book. It's well researched and it gives lots of examples. And so maybe we can get into it. The way I see it is that we have no perfect city, but your book highlights perfectly good programs that cities are implementing. And it's broken up into 4 chapters: reclaim the streets, tear up the concrete, plant the city, adapt the shoreline. So let's dig into some of the examples. Reclaim the streets. We've covered the idea of complete streets on the show a couple of times, which is approach to designing streets that enable safe access for all people who need to use them, including pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities. So you have an example in there. Tell us about Minneapolis and how they make their streets safe for everyone.
Yeah, so Minneapolis is an amazing biking city. It has, separated bikeways going throughout many parts of it. And these were old like rail lines that were transformed into things like the Midtown Greenway. But not, that kind of infrastructure that provides safety for cyclists doesn't exist everywhere across the city. And so I interviewed 2 people, Alexis Penny and Will Lumpkins, who live in North Minneapolis. And they've been really at the forefront of looking at how to make a greenway through their neighborhood in North Minneapolis, which is a neighborhood with a majority of residents of color and many people living below the poverty line. And so what was interesting is that at first, and this was true of many of the case studies in the book, at first there was, very well-intentioned projects to bring a greenway to North Minneapolis, but it was really originated by the city and by the folks in the health department. And it wasn't until it could be held by and really promoted by the folks that live in that neighborhood that the greenway gained traction. So it actually failed at first, and people fought to take it out of their neighborhood. But when a trusted source like Will and Alexis were there to help focus people's attention on what a greenway could be, not just pick one of these options, A, B, or C, and they're all some version of a bikeway, but really what can the greenway offer? Can it offer local businesses more opportunities? Can it offer a safe way for kids to get to school? Can it provide much of the infrastructure that was missing and the investment that was missing from that neighborhood? Also, in terms of public transit, which can help make it possible to create greenways by removing parking on the street and things like that. So really, and I found this across the book, that it's so important that communities are leading these efforts to make them effective and to really make them meet their needs.
And as you said, everyone wants big projects, but good projects can start small and organically grow and change a neighborhood. And a big part of that is a sense of place. And you give an example of the importance of creating a sense of place. And you highlight your hometown, San Francisco, as an example. What are they doing right when it comes to developing that sense of place?
Well, San Francisco is a unique city in that, as I described earlier, with examples like Parking Day and tactical urbanism, those sort of small scale approaches are—
I like that, tactical urbanism.
Yes, and it's not just my term. An author named Mike Lydon really coined that, and I think he put his finger on something that was happening, but he helped to kind of codify it. And those experiments were happening a lot in San Francisco because people felt frustrated with local government not doing things rapidly enough. And so they started doing things like paying for a parking spot and turning it into a park. But those efforts grew over time, and what started as tactical approaches really became city sanctioned projects. So for example, we grew from 80 parklets, which are official year-long permitted parks, taking over a parking spot, which feature, they're little micro parks with seating and, greenery and bike spots. We had maybe 80 before the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit, we got 5,000 shared space applications. So it's been this explosion of how, and really an illustration, as you point out, of how things can start small, but they can rapidly grow. especially when you have things like policies in place and ideas for how to shape those. And San Francisco's been good at that. They've had great leaders within the city planning department that have helped foster things that have born out of the design and arts community here.
So embellish a little bit on, I'm not familiar with parking spots becoming parks. How does that work? Sounds interesting.
Yeah, so, and you may have recognized them from the pandemic, because a lot of the, public eating spaces that were taken over in the street when the pandemic hit to keep businesses alive and restaurants alive, those were really using and building on the illustration, the Parklet program that started here in San Francisco and spread throughout the country. They've been used in many cities to create public space and former parking spots. And again, they're just small micro parks. They really can serve any need. They've been used by businesses like coffee shops, but they've also been used by schools to create, outdoor classrooms or galleries to create, spaces for artwork, or we went to a movie screening in a parklet here close by. So they've been used for lots of different things.
Interesting.
And during the pandemic, they caught fire. So.
Well, San Francisco's always been on the forefront of new innovation. So let's get to the next chapter, Tear Up the Concrete. I mentioned in the introduction about green infrastructure. A lot of people may not be familiar with that, but you have an essay in the book by, I may not pronounce this right, Mami Hara?
Yeah, Mami Hara.
She has green infrastructure lessons from US cities. And for those that aren't familiar with green infrastructure, can you summarize the takeaways that are mentioned in this essay?
Yeah, I think, well, Mami speaks to it in her own way from her experiences, because she started off in Philadelphia and then went to Seattle and has been a real leader in forming green infrastructure across the country. So her way of approaching it is very reflective of her experiences as a city leader. In the chapters that illustrate, there's 3 cities that really speak to green infrastructure. And what I found was a through line through all of them, was the idea that really, again, that people, neighbors, and community members really can lead that. And I think the most glaring example was really in New Orleans, where, after Hurricane Katrina, a woman named Angela Chalk from the 7th Ward, she was the cornerstone of her neighborhood and ran a group called the Healthy Community Services. She was one of the first people to move back to her neighborhood. And she started directing resources through WaterWise Gulf South to invest in green infrastructure in her neighborhood. And the first way she did it was she helped turn out volunteers to remake her own yard as a demonstration project with bioswales and ram barrels and native plants. And when the next storm hit and her place didn't flood, her neighbors wanted the same kinds of remedies in their own yards. And so really, knowing her neighbors and her neighborhood, she was able to bring people together around how green infrastructure works and how it really complements the very complex network of levees and pumps and canals that run throughout New Orleans. And now the 7th Ward has entire blocks of demonstration projects, and it's part of a training program called the WaterWise Champions, which really makes people in the neighborhoods that have been hit the hardest by flooding the experts in green infrastructure solutions. It's a really, really exciting project.
And I've always been a big advocate of those, using nature to create really a sponge that really sucks up the water rather than conveying it in pipes and taking it off site into different watersheds. So yeah, I think that's fantastic. So on GreenSense, we've always focused on the cost benefit of doing sustainable initiatives. So in the chapter Plant the City, what's the cost benefit of planting more trees in cities? Why do it beyond just the aesthetic reasons? Where's the cost benefit?
So, what's interesting about the idea of cost too is the concept of, what are we not paying for, right? So ecosystem services are a big part of that. We don't necessarily think about, we should pay for the idea of a tree absorbing water, or absorbing pollution, or providing habitat, or sequestering carbon. But obviously, all of those things are really just left out of our economic system. They're a huge part of the way that trees perform. And I think a lot of cities that have made an effort to create to expand their urban tree canopy have really seen the benefit from that, because they've equated costs with, they've said, oh, how much are we spending in healthcare because this neighborhood is polluted? Or how much are we spending in green infrastructure because it's flooding, right? So those were the really interesting parts of looking at urban forestry more broadly. And in most cities, we're at about 27% urban tree canopy on average, but American Forest really recommends something like 40%. And unfortunately, too, urban canopy is not shared equally. So if you look at the history of redlining maps, it almost completely overlaps with with tree canopy maps today. And that means that in cities like Baltimore, where, in an affluent neighborhood, you might have 50% tree canopy cover, but in redline neighborhoods, you could have as little as 6%, which means that on a hot day, there's a 6% difference between two neighborhoods in the same city. So, as we continue to encounter heat and rising temperatures in cities, trees are a really important way in helping us to manage heat and keep people safe.
And something hard to quantify because it's not as straightforward as calculating the cost of putting in a sewer line, which is pretty quantifiable. Well, let's get on to the last one, adapt the shoreline. Almost every city is built at or near a source of surface or groundwater. And tell us how New York City is a good example of adapting the shoreline by growing 1 billion oysters.
Yeah,
I'm an oyster lover, so I want to hear this one.
Isn't this an exciting project? I know. The Billion Oyster Project is actually building on to your last point about trees. New York actually led a really ambitious project to plant 1 million trees, and they did the math behind, figuring out the ecosystem services and made that economic sense from it. And the Billion Oyster Project was captivated by that idea. Like, it really got people thinking and imagining what the city could be like. You may know that New York Harbor used to be full of oysters, and so in many ways this is recreating what already existed. But Pete Milanowski and his colleagues have created an amazing project called the Billion Oyster Project, where they're based on Governor's Island in New York Harbor. And they have, and there's a public school that they work with. So the curriculum of the school is really comes out of this interest in growing 1 billion oysters in New York Harbor. But they also have oyster reefs throughout New York Harbor. So I looked at one in particular in Soundview, where they had created a community oyster reef, where community members and local schools were helping to maintain oyster reefs, and they studied it and found that because of a remnant oyster population and its connection between the newly imported oysters, that they actually were getting great results. And so that oyster reef has continued to grow. And even while I was writing the book, they were finding more and more oysters when they reconstructed what was formerly called the Tappan Zee Bridge and turned into the Governor Cuomo Bridge. I can't remember what the new name of it is, but when they were doing the construction, they found also a remnant population of oysters. And as I was finishing the last chapters of the book, I had scientists that were studying oysters there sending me pictures of amazing recruitment on these oyster reefs. So it's very exciting what's going on in New York Harbor. And oyster reefs are part of a larger set of solutions, nature-based solutions for adapting our shorelines. And they include wetlands restoration, all kinds of things that we can do by looking at how biodiversity can also be a big part of adapting to climate change in cities.
Well, in my experience working with mayors around the country on brownfield redevelopment and sustainability, I found that the budget process and the building codes to be the two biggest impediments when it comes to implementing sustainable initiatives. In your opinion, you talk in the book about how fast the climate's changing and that we have to move quickly. What are you seeing as the biggest impediments to making cities more resilient?
I think that actually there's a lot of really positive direction in terms of people wanting solutions like this. I think people are concerned about climate change. very broadly, I think people are concerned about climate change. And I think they reasonably see cities as the place to act, as you pointed out, that, cities are responsible for 75% of global carbon emissions, and they happen to be where we live. So these kinds of solutions are really important in people's lives. And I think even in something like transportation, where we think, oh, people will never get out of their cars, right? We have to remember that that we actually have a long history in this country of people not driving, right? Of sharing our streets. We used to, over 100 years ago, we had streets where people walked and bike and took public transit, and we had all of those options. I think that right now, what we need to do is remember that we need to create options for people again, so that especially people that want to get around without a private automobile can do that. And that means that we need to invest in those kinds of solutions that make things like transportation available to everyone.
Well, your book is in-depth, it's well-researched work that highlights many success stories. So I'll do a hypothetical. If all your successful programs featured in your book were implemented by more cities, how would that cure pollution, crime, homelessness, and reduce the high cost of living in cities? Because when I go around the country, our cities aren't great places. There's lots of issues there.
Yeah.
So in closing, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, obviously you're pointing to a huge, huge problem and systemic problem. And I think that is the right focus. How do we use our efforts around climate change to really look at the systemic and underlying problems that face our country? Yes, green infrastructure and transportation and adapting our shorelines and even planting trees are all part of that solution. But it's really important for us to create equity, more equitable cities. And part of the ways to do that are to create avenues so that people have access to transportation, which affords access to education and jobs and the resources of the city. We need to create jobs for people that don't currently have them and people that have been formerly incarcerated so that they can get onto a different road ahead to building a different life. And I think that when we can embrace those ideas that these are systemic problems, we can, with the opportunities that we have ahead, we can face them with systemic solutions. Then all of these pieces can be part of looking at that. Not one single piece of it will solve it all, but I think together we can find a solution.
Yes, I think that's part of the answer. I also see, I know in our work in developing contaminated properties around the country, one of the unintended consequences was that you took these blighted areas, you displaced people, and you created high value in the area. And it's these expensive housing issues in all these cities that have just made cities unaffordable for the masses. And I don't know what the answer is to that. Sustainable cities are great, but that's something we're going to have to dive into. We're out of time. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I could talk to you all day. This is something I've really liked for a long time. I think you hit on some really great examples, and it's all got to start somewhere. So success in small doses around the country, shared by others, hopefully we'll get more success. So congratulations on the book. It was named one of the best of 22. It's an informative and thought-provoking read. And thank you for joining us on GreenSense Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's Alison Sant, author of From the Ground Up, Local Efforts to Create Resilient Cities. I'm Robert Colangelo. Thank you for listening to GreenSense, and check out the GreenSense Minute every Thursday and Saturday on 105.9 FM, WBBM Chicago. And visit the GreenSenseShow.com website to learn more about sponsorship. Thank you, Alison. That was wonderful.
I'm sorry I couldn't solve all of our problems.